So I am going to tell you about a little bit of background about the Radiata pine estate, which is most of what gets grown commercially in New Zealand, and the regulation of genetic modification in that context, and some of the aspects of the work going on there. I really want to thank Dr. Jha for that nice talk that he just gave. It was a very good introduction to some of the things that I now don't really have to explain. There are the drivers that are being used in New Zealand forestry are very similar, trying to grow trees on non-arable land, food versus fuel. And there is a lot of work on biomaterials and biofuels going on with pine trees in New Zealand. So just to tell you a little bit, before I get to the regulatory bits, which is all text, I'll give you some nice pictures first. So New Zealand's plantation forestry estate is 1.7 million hectares as of 2015. And 90% of this is Pinus radiata, otherwise known as Monterey pine, which is a North American species. And it's found only in isolated pockets in North America, around the San Francisco area, and a few isolated islands off the west coast of Mexico. So a very limited range in its native habitat, and that's outdone by far where it's grown commercially. So New Zealand is not the only place where it's grown commercially. It's also grown in South Africa, Australia, and Chile. So in New Zealand, though, 50,000 hectares are harvested per year. And so the number that comes from that I've given here for 2015 is pretty average for what we see in New Zealand. This actually, forestry is the third largest commercial sector in New Zealand. As I told you on Monday, most of New Zealand's economy is driven by the primary sector. And $5 billion in export revenue essentially makes this the third biggest sector, and dairy being the first by a pretty substantial margin. Right, so just to give a little bit more context on that, just the contribution of New Zealand's main 65 commercially grown plant species to its GDP. Ryegrass is not harvested as a crop directly, obviously. It's used as feed for cattle to drive the dairy industry, which is why it's worth $14 billion a year in New Zealand. But Pinus radiata is in second place with $4.5 billion for revenue. Douglas fir, I did forget to mention that 90% of the forestry estate in New Zealand is Pinus radiata. Most of the rest of that, the 10%, is Douglas fir, and most of that is grown in the South Island. Now, in many ways, Douglas fir gives you superior quality wood, but it does take a lot longer to grow, and it grows in very different conditions to radiata pine. So it is a bit more limited, and it's mostly grown in the South Island, where the radiata is primarily grown on the north. So just to put this in the context of global plantation forestry, Oceania, of which New Zealand is a part, so it's the Pacific Islands, New Zealand, and Australia contribute about 2% of global area to plantation forests. Asia, 53%. I wasn't able to get the statistics for India, but the total plantation forest area in the world is 291 million hectares, and about 53 million hectares of that is production forest. Of that production forest, 54% of that area is actually radiata pine, so it is a pretty important species in that regard, and so that's why it's the focus of a lot of development work and has been for quite some time. So, as I say, I'm going to be showing you some pretty dull slides in a few minutes, so I thought I'd give you some nice pictures to look at. Just to put it in the perspective of what the benefit of plantation forestry is to New Zealand, is New Zealand used to be a very much a rainforest, essentially covered with trees. After European colonization, a lot of those trees were cut down for commercial purposes, but also to clear area for farming. And so there's very little native forest left, and so the radiata pine estate actually serves as a good buffer to protect what is left of the native forests. So 29 million cubic meters of wood was harvested in 2015 from plantations versus only 29,000 from natural forests. So these are some pictures of rather iconic species and areas around New Zealand. This tree. So this particular tree here, I'll use the cursor instead to try to make this work, it's got a name. It's called Tane Mahuta. It means God of the forest. It is a kauri tree. It's one of New Zealand's iconic species. It's over 2,000 years old. It's about 50 meters tall, 4 meters in diameter, and 14 meters around. But as kauri trees go, it's pretty small. It's on the lower middle end of the scale, but it is the biggest kauri tree that's left in New Zealand. The ones that were harvested in the 19th century, some of them had diameters over 10 meters. So there was a lot lost, and so there's still a lot of importance to protecting this. There are a number of native bird species. As I told you, most of our vertebrate animals are birds, so these often nest in these sorts of areas. Some of them do nest in plantation forests, however. But the important part here is that this actually does help to protect some of that native diversity, biodiversity, and so is important from that perspective. And that's where we come in with the EPA, because the purpose of the HASNO Act is about protecting New Zealand's native biodiversity. So radiata pine is New Zealand's all-purpose forestry species. It's not grown in New Zealand because it's the greatest forestry tree that's ever been. It just is essentially something that you can use for just about any application, even though it's not necessarily the best at any of those particular applications. So it is used for structural timber, veneers, molding, and pulp and paper. And this actually, in the research programs that are going on in New Zealand, has a direct link to biofuels. To come back up to the top of the slide, the picture there just shows you what radiata pine looks like in its native range. It's sort of a scraggly tree that grows in a number of different directions. It's, the reason it grows so well in New Zealand is that it is what's called a fog belt species. So high moisture, fairly low temperature, moderate temperatures, but never gets truly hot. And so that's been improved over the last 70 years of New Zealand's plantation forestry, to the point where you essentially get very long, straight boles, very rapidly growing. The entire state is genetically improved. It's grown on a 25-year rotation, and the current yield is about 1,700 tons per hectare, and that's improving at 2% per year just with genetics. So the reason that New Zealand is pushing hard in this area is the global demand for wood and wood products is predicted to rise pretty dramatically in the next 30 to 40 years. And so that it doesn't matter what the application is, sawn and milled wood, wood-based panels, all expected to rise pretty substantially, as well as paper, paperboard, and simply round wood. So in terms of what's happening research-wise, there is work in genetic modification going on in New Zealand, and there is a currently active field trial. And that's regulated by the EPA, which used to be the Environmental Risk Management Authority, which was created in 1996. And I won't dwell on this slide because I have covered most of this information already. Just suffice it to say that all GMOs, until approved for release by the EPA, are considered to be new organisms. Once they are approved for release, they no longer become, as long as that's a full release with no conditions, then they're no longer considered to be GMOs and no longer considered to be new. So what is a GMO under HASNO? It's a very broad definition. There are exemptions and regulations, as I told you. Modification through in vitro techniques, or basically any progeny that are descended from any organism that's created through those methods. So there are a number of relevant approval pathways that the EPA uses for GM trees. Importation into containment, that's about laboratory use. I won't be talking about that. Or development in containment. So if you want to import, you have to get one approval. If you want to do further genetic modification work on it, you have to get another approval. Field trials in containment, as I've already discussed, but this is where I'll talk about first in more detail. Nothing potentially heritable is allowed to escape, and I'll come back to release approvals a bit later in the talk. Now, as I've said, there is an existing field trial approval that was given in 2010, so the number 2004 has nothing to do with the year that it was issued. This this replaces an old field trial approval that dates back to, I think, 2000, 2001, that was primarily allowed the testing of environmental effects. So when genetic modification first came on the scene in any sort of meaningful way in New Zealand, there were huge protests and lots of concerns about environmental effects, and so that was where most of the research institutes actually went first. The results of that have shown, and we've heard this from other talks, that there are effects on the microbiome from growing these things, but is that good, is that bad? You know, there does seem to be a bit of balance. There was also some work done on non-target organisms, particularly specifically invertebrates, insects and so forth. No effects were found there. So on that basis, Scion moved ahead with the second approval for more commercially relevant traits. And so they have been working on tree improvement for a number of years, but have moved to more of a biomaterials and biofuels sort of approach to the work that they do. So the traits that they got approval from the EPA for were for growth and biomass acquisition, so essentially more rapid growth, which is important in terms of just sheer production. Reproductive development, that essentially pertains to sterility, because you know, the pines are wind-pollinated species, so there is a potential for a lot of gene flow from these species. Herbicide tolerance, a lot of pine species, the radiata is grown on land that is not readily what you'd call arable land, steep hillsides and things like that. When these plants are very young, they can be easily outcompeted by weedy species for the first 2 years of their lives, so herbicide is often manually applied to sort of suppress that in the first couple of years, and then after that they do fine without that. On these hilly slopes, it can be a bit more difficult, and aerial application would be useful. If the trees themselves are sensitive, then that's no good. So that's a trait that's being that's being researched. So utilizable biomass, so that pertains again to biofuels, potentially other biomaterials applications. Wood density, radiata pine is not a particularly dense wood. As I said, it's an all-purpose wood, but it's not always the best at things. And dimensional stability. Because it grows so fast, it does tend to warp a lot. And so understanding how that can be changed is a key focus of research there as well. So the environmental effects are still part of the research program, but these are now secondary goals. Right, so I think I've already covered a bit on the definition of field trials, but it is about outdoor containment, so it's the same standards as would apply to indoor containment. Nothing heritable may escape. This works for large animals, and so breeding is going on there, but that doesn't happen in any plant species in New Zealand, because it's essentially impossible to prove that nothing has escaped. So obviously this is not a pine flower, but flowering is not allowed in any trial right at the moment in New Zealand. Okay, so to come to release approvals, these are also a potential pathway for pine trees. These can be done without controls, or they can be done with controls as conditional, what we would call a conditional release. And so those would still be considered to be GMOs, but they would be out in the environment and potentially allowed to flower. But in order for that to actually gain approval, there are a few hurdles that must be leapt over, and the HASNO Act, as it currently stands, puts up some pretty high barriers for that right at the moment. I'll skip this slide. This just goes on about the regulations that I talked about on Monday. So to get on to the bits of what must be considered for any sort of release approval, and even to a certain extent field trial approvals, is that we have what are called the minimum standards in the HASNO Act. And these are pretty tough standards to try to meet. Some introductions have been met, particularly with biocontrol agents. But again, with plant species, with pollen and so forth, it's kind of hard to do this. But many of these approvals pathways actually require public notification. So all field trials must be publicly notified. Conditional releases must be notified. Any full release application must also be notified. So it is a pretty difficult row to hoe. And if any with public notification, we ask for submissions. And so anybody that is interested can actually submit on approvals. And I think that's, you know, an excellent part of what the Has No Act is about, but it can lead to, it can be pretty fraught at times, particularly when submitters wish to be heard. Then we hold a public hearing. So, in order to obtain approval for release of any GMO, the trees would have to, we would have to take into account all the information presented to us, including public submissions, statements and testimony at hearings, evaluate the benefits of the release against the risks. And this is where probably the greatest difficulty comes into effect for getting approvals, because we essentially, in terms of the way the regulation is structured with flowering plants, or any plant species for that matter, the benefits are almost impossible to evaluate, because you cannot actually grow the plants to assess the benefit of what any potential genetic modification might be, because you can't say that you won't establish an undesirable population during that testing. So the decision maker, which is the EPA, but that can either be our chief executive in some cases or a decision-making committee, must be satisfied that the organism meets the requirements of those minimum standards and the additional matters to be considered as part of its risk assessment. To date, no application has quite got there yet. So the barriers to full-scale testing and release of genetically modified pine in New Zealand are very high. We sit with what I call a catch-22 situation as regards plant testing. So we have half of the Has No Act that we essentially are evaluating applications on. The other half, the benefit, is essentially impossible to do. Now, as I mentioned, there is work being done on engineered sterility in tree species, particularly pine in New Zealand. If that can be established that good sterility has been obtained, that may actually be the key to meeting the requirements of those minimum standards and additional matters, which might eventually lead to a release in New Zealand. And I think that's all I have. And since I've bored you with all those texts, I thought I'd give you some more forest pictures. So thank you very much.